Definitely. Good morning one more time, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen here in the room and also those who are watching us online. As the latest information, this number is increasing rapidly, so the interest is huge. Our seminar conference today is organized in following way. The first panel, we're going to discuss the functions and commitments of NATO, looking from point of view of larger perspective. Is there something behind collective defense we should take into account? Should we expand the core identity of NATO? And of course, the second panel goes more in details and more into discussion on the collective defense. We are a very distinguished panel, and we're going to start, this day with the functions and with the quite a philosophical kind of question, what the NATO really is today, and strategic adaptation, where it should drive the NATO internally, how we within the NATO understand it, and externally, how others see the NATO from abroad. The organizational perspective is that our key speaker is going to speak, then we're going to take one privileged comment from neighbor country Estonia, and then we're going to switch directly to the Q&A session, taking all the questions in one amount and then answering them. So, gentlemen, I'm happy to start this day with introducing Tacan Ildem, NATO Assistant Secretary General of Public Diplomacy. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It is indeed a pleasure for me to be here today, and I would like to thank the organizers of this important meeting. Warsaw Summit meeting is less than a month from now, and we are in the midst of preparations, and this is the right moment to reflect upon what would be the deliverables of that summit meeting. We had in Brussels the meeting of the defense ministers, and I must say that it was an important milestone in our preparations. When I look to NATO's role in the challenging time that we are going through, of course, one can say that NATO is continuously adapting itself. And when I compare those years of the Cold War, the challenges are much more complex, and we see different threats and challenges are coming from different directions, not only from the east but south as well, and it requires us to have a 360-degree security perspective, to be ready and capable to respond to these threats and challenges in a meaningful manner. The defense ministers had the opportunity to reflect upon ways to strengthen deterrence and defense, and at the same time to project stability beyond our borders. All these two strands of activity were in fact on the basis of this 360-degree approach. And the discussion on enhanced forward presence towards the east was one of the main considerations, and the discussion on the military advice was quite good, and I think it paved the way for the discussion and decisions to be made by heads of state and government. Regarding the projections of stability beyond our borders, I think it is very important to be able to deal with counterterrorism, hybrid warfare, and also the challenges emanating from instability in countries in the neighborhood. And in that respect, they had a good discussion regarding how NATO could further its involvement in capacity building in Iraq, in discussing the challenges of migration, refugee movement, and how NATO, in a complementary way, have its value added together with other international organizations like the European Union. So all these were in the core of the discussion with a view to strengthening NATO's capacity to protect its citizens and to add to its capacity to project security beyond borders. Talking about the strength of NATO, I think one has to see that we are a defensive organization, and all our decisions and measures are proportionate and also in line with international commitments. When we talk about strengthening of deterrence and defense, equally important is dialogue. And therefore, our approach is two-track approach. While taking credible measures, we at the same time attach importance to have transparency and to reduce the risks involved and to be predictable. And in that sense, we want to see reciprocal engagement in transparency and risk reduction. The complex challenges that we are facing requires determined steps. For instance, in Afghanistan, what NATO has been doing was important, and we require to continue with our long-term commitment in order that Afghanistan will not be a safe haven for terrorism. Right now, we cannot just focus on immediate threats and challenges next to our borders. We have to think about the challenges that don't see any border or restriction. Cyber security is one particular area, and in that respect, I have to say that we need to strengthen the resilience of the alliance in face of the new challenges, be it hybrid warfare, cyber security, and all these would require also effective cooperation between NATO and the European Union. During the meetings of defense ministers, there was a dedicated session on strengthening cooperation and coordination between NATO and the European Union. High Representative Mogherini was present during these discussions. Our two partners, Finland and Sweden, also took part in these discussions. When we look at the challenges that come from the south, we also require to have a maritime security strategy. And this would also necessitate a division of labor in a complementary fashion to join forces with other international organizations to deal with these challenges. Therefore, it would be easy perhaps to frame the discussion by saying whether NATO is going back to its basics. Of course, our hope was to have our focus more on cooperative security, but right now, since 2014, the new security environment required NATO to have a sharpened focus on the collective defense component of its fundamental tasks. Nevertheless, it also requires us not to shy away from our responsibilities and focused attention on crisis management and cooperative security tasks. Therefore, it is a more complex security environment which we do not have a simple answer. And the most important thing is, I believe, to deliver on the core tasks of NATO in these three spheres, be it collective defense, cooperative security, and crisis management. Perhaps I stop here so that we could have more time for questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ildem. And logically, the main question of panel is to stick to the core or to the expand, and the reality is that we have to do the both. Then there is, I believe, a chain of risks, because we always exist in limited resources environment. But there is someone who can communicate those risks of NATO out in a very proper manner. So if I'm asking the question, what are the challenges and the risks for NATO, then I believe Jānis Sārts, Director of NATO Strategic Communication Center of Excellence, can communicate this side very effectively out. So floor for Jānis Sārts.
Well, okay, this way. Well, thank you, Mārtiņ. Well, let me start by Mr. Ildem left, which is, we are back to the origins, or are we? I would say that actually we never left them. Because if you think what's the origin, or what the core of the NATO is the fact that a group of nations sharing the same value system, sharing the same worldview, are coming together and saying, we'll stand for each other. So I think the core has been that all along. The world around these nations has changed. And because of the adaptive nature of the alliance, the way we see the response, these have been different. 10 years it was one response, 20 years ago it was another response. Now we're getting a different kind of response. But I think the core is the same, and that's where the strength comes from, is because these values are the coordinate system against which you understand, you are ready to stand for each other. Why parliaments are agreeing to send their soldiers to other allies, because of these value systems. And that has not been changed over all the decades. But I grant you, yes, the environment changes. It changes rapidly and all the time. And currently, I fully agree with those that use that probably a bit more, rather use term challenging. Because if I look at the risks that NATO faces, Mr. Ildem said 360 degrees. But I would say 360 degrees in three different parameters. First, geographically. Obviously, the risks we talk here mostly about, which is coming from the East, are not the only ones facing the alliance. And the ones that are coming from the East doesn't only touch the countries in the neighborhood. They really go deeper into the other NATO countries' core values against them. And the same way also the risks from the South, although not that visible here, are also risks for us. The second 360-degree point is the type of threat. Because if you think what is attacked or what it is at risk, it's just not a military thing. It is the way our opponents try to attack the political systems, political processes per se, infrastructures, critical infrastructures. Is it energy? Is it transportation? The New World allows for doing that. It also, and it also has an element of a military. So, total risk to the society. So we have to think about the total response. And also the third 360-degree sort of approach is to what we have to do. Is, of course, we as an alliance deal with the deterrence. But at the same time we deal with assurance. We still have tasks within the crisis management. We still are having tasks to help other nations to build their capabilities. Nothing of that is not, it's not any more relevant. It is still relevant, but new tasks have come in. So in the three ways, 360-degree approach is necessary. So let me touch now about these new elements that I see we're facing. Because in many cases, people, probably not that much experts, but certainly the public, think NATO equals military, equals security. But in modern environment, to think in these terms would not really think through the problem adequately. Because, of course, if you think, obviously, NATO is by far most military capable alliance, so it is very hard to challenge it on these terms, although some might try. But if you think of the other options, how do you deal with the security? If you devise the instruments to actually hamper the political processes within the country through a set of measures, you can achieve the things without actually full military confrontation. If you think of the way cyber world enables ability to reach out globally, to target individually, and at the same time have a reasonable possibility to say, I'm not involved. You have another layer of security issues that one has to deal. So, to me, we have to think more as a societies of embracing this approach, that it's not only for the few agencies within the government. That is, as in old days was called, total defense. I'm not saying you have to adopt the old way of total defense, but the approach of the totality of the security, I think, is something that we have to reintroduce into our vocabulary, and not only in vocabulary, in our toolbox. And that is something that I think governments are starting to actually deal with. But that said, does it mean military are not there on the picture? Obviously they are. Obviously they are, because it is one of the toolbox in the spectrum that within the crisis might be used. And of course, it's not only about the force itself. In many times, it's about the potential of doing that. And if you think of this, and I'm come from now analyzing the communicative world, we act based on the perceptions of the realities around us. So if you tamper with the perception, you can actually tamper with the behaviors, with the way people react to things. And certainly if I think of along the whole spectrum of signals that you can send to impact the perception and thus behavior, military is by far the most potent signal that one can send, and therefore is actually one of the key instruments, of course, if you want to really have for a high, strong messaging. So, and it's not only about signals. Actually doing an operation or an exercise is also as strong. And I think we have to accept that kind of approach, Not only that our opponents are doing that, but we have to understand and think in these categories. If I think of a future, I think future brings even more change. Now we see people are developing these ways how to make decisions based on data. Whenever you talk to the modern sort of company, they say they don't rely on instinct. They rely on good, sound analysis of data. That is what the future will bring. What do you think it will bring into the sort of security and warfare environment? That will be if you are able to tamper with the data, you're able to influence the other decision makings. So it is going to grow in these areas. And obviously the way the society, modern societies change will also impact the way the new threats will evolve. That doesn't say that they will be the only ones on the field. Actually doing the pure, crude military action will still be relevant, but we'll have to cater for more and more areas to ensure that our societies are safe and secure. And that's what I think NATO is good at. Because one thing that you can't take away from NATO, that's adaptability. When I remember the history of NATO, it has been, the funeral has been started like 5 or 6 times because, it's irrelevant, times it's too old, and etc. It has been persistently there and always answering the challenge. So I think we'll do that once again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sārts. And of course, sending signals and strong communicative messages is not only for externals, but also for ourselves and perception. So I'm happy to introduce the South perspective, Mr. Alessandro Marrone, Senior Fellow of Security and Defense Program at the International Affairs Institute, Italy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a great pleasure for me to speak this highly qualified panel and with this very numerous audience. My input will cover 2 main topics: the balance among NATO core tasks and an Italian view on NATO role in the South. So, first, well, as you all know, the current strategic concept envisages 3 core tasks for NATO: collective defense, crisis management operation, and cooperative security, including enlargement, partnership, and arms control and non-proliferation. And this strategic concept is a compromise by itself among different views of allies. In 2010, when the document was adopted, NATO had already experienced a 20-years-long debate among allies on its role in the post-Cold War security environment. And you may remind the US and UK argued for 2 decades that NATO should go expeditionary and do primarily crisis management operation outside of the territory of member states, covered by the Article 5, wherever needed. According to US Senator Lukasz, the choice for NATO was out of area or out of business. At that time, France, Germany, Spain in part, opposed to this view, in favor of a regional focus of NATO on collective defense. And Italy has always tried to balance both views by saying that NATO should do both crisis management operation and collective defense. It may seem a paradox to you that the countries, the European countries, that at that time argued for a European focus of NATO on collective defense, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, etc., now are saying that NATO should not do only collective defense. But it's not a paradox. At that time, early 2000s, the pendulum of NATO priorities was shifting too much toward crisis management, and it was a mistake, because it underestimated the security of Europe and the development in Russia. Now, the NATO pendulum is shifting back too much towards collective defense, and it is a mistake as well. This is one of the reasons countries like Italy or France have views different than the Baltic ones on NATO core tasks and the priority for collective defense. Of course, these views largely depend on threat perception. So whether you give higher priority to Russia or terrorism or instability causing mass migration. But it's not just different threat perception. It's good for all member states and for NATO as a whole if NATO maintains a balance among its three core tasks and keep all of them on the same level of priority. The idea of going back to the origins in terms of only collective defense may be misleading, particularly in the current security environment, when collective defense, crisis management operation, and partnership are very, very interlinked. Think about Ukraine. The partnership with Ukraine belongs to cooperative security core task, but it does help the collective defense core task because a stable, free, and peaceful Ukraine improves also the territorial security of NATO members. And the same goes for the partners in the fight against terrorism, such as Jordan, Tunisia, Iraq, and in the next future, maybe Libya. NATO support to them, through partnership, contributes to defense and security of NATO members itself. Second and last part of my brief speech, an Italian view on NATO role in the South. Here, my institute has done a lot in terms of events and publications, so let me go very straight to 4 concrete elements without dwelling in the history and characters of the region. What NATO can do. Here, you have an arch of instability that generates security threats like terrorism, mass migration, risk for maritime security and energy security. So it's different than a state actor like Russia threatening hybrid warfare. What NATO can do? First, defense capacity building with partners. It has already been mentioned by the Deputy Assistant Secretary General. The first line of defense is not only on the Italian coast or on the Turkish borders or on Brussels banlieue. Not only. It's in the ability of countries in Middle East and North Africa to counter terrorism, to counter radicalization, to control their own territory, and to control their own coastlines. And NATO can do much on this to support them in loco. Second, maritime security. NATO is running the operation Active Endeavour in the Mediterranean since 2001 with an anti-terrorism mandate. And NATO has launched last February a naval operation in the Aegean Sea to support member states there in dealing with the mass migration crisis. The mandate and assets of these 2 operations should be enhanced and enlarged in a synergic way, and in cooperation with the European Union and with EU naval operation in the Mediterranean Sea, as well as with national one. Italy is running its own national naval operation in the Mediterranean. It's not just about operation. NATO should adopt a new maritime strategy. The current document is of 2011, and it has become obsolete because the rapid changes in the security environment we saw. Third point, intelligence sharing. NATO assets like OWOCs, ground and naval system, should be employed more in the Mediterranean region to support the fight against Islamic State and terrorism, and the efforts to counter criminals smuggling human beings by providing intelligence. Fourth and last, political dialogue. Let's be frank. Countries in Middle East and North Africa compete against each other, and they may tolerate or even support instability and groups affiliated to Islamic terrorism. If we don't work on a process for a political solution for the crisis in Libya and in Syria, if we don't de-escalate the competition among regional powers, we will not tackle the arch of crisis in the south. Has NATO a lead in this process? No. There is the Vienna process for Syria, there is the Rome process for Libya. But NATO can do a lot in terms of political and diplomatic terms to support this process through bilateral and multilateral dialogue. And I'm thinking about Mediterranean Dialogue and Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, as well as by supporting the convergence of NATO members' agenda on Middle East and North Africa, which at the moment are not that on the same page. With this, I thank you for your attention. I have further points from an Italian perspective on deterrence and dialogue toward Russia, but I will leave them for the debate if necessary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marrone. And already the European issue was touched as an organizational perspective. I'm happy to introduce Lukasz Kulesa from Research Director at the European Leadership Network. Please.
Thank you very much, and let me start with thanking Andres and his team for the invitation and also for the support of the sponsors, which I'm happy to say include the Polish Embassy As you may know, my organization is headquartered in London, but we got a European approach, and personally, my heart is very close to Warsaw and Poland. So at different layers, and they all meet in Riga, Latvia. Thank you very much, Andris. I decided, we had very rich presentations, a lot of philosophical questions were asked, so I decided to simplify things and maybe stupefy things a little bit, and say that NATO is somewhere between Britney Spears and Nina Simone. Let me explain. Britney Spears, if you remember this famous hit, I Was Born to Make You Happy. Some of you may remember 1990s, late 1990s, early 2000s. So in the past, NATO in some years was exactly making this impression that it was born to make all the allies happy. In a sense, it was born to respond to every single request on every single issue that an ally would put in the agenda, especially in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and also the period when it was more or less clear that the Afghan operation was coming to an end. There were a lot of questions of what else NATO can do. Let's go into energy security, let's go into broader state building, let's go to emergency responses to civilian civilian situation, disasters. We sent NATO response force elements to Pakistan to help with the earthquake. So a very, very broad agenda. Nina Simone, my baby just cares for me, in a sense that right now we're back to the foundations, we're back to the core tasks, which for a number of countries, especially in our area, means that NATO should be here for us, and mainly for us. Of course, there are other areas, there is the South, and there are global issues, but this is basically what NATO should do, caring for us and our little region. My argument is that NATO should position itself somewhere between Britney Spears and Nina Simone. This identity crisis, more or less, is over. We know that there are challenges in the East and in the South. So we know that the focus on collective defense and deterrence will stay for the next couple of years. But we know that the new approach would just, or I would argue that the new approach can't be just about security and Article 5 related tasks, because there are challenges immediately beyond our border which needs to be addressed. There are expectations also for members, as we heard from Italy, and also from some of our publics to engage in broader issues than just Article 5. But on the other hand, I think there is a knowledge, or there should be a knowledge, that NATO does not have the resources to be an a la carte organization with a long list of priorities. Because if you have a restaurant in which there is a very long list of dishes, it's usually a bad restaurant, because they do a lot of things, but they do all of them badly. So I think NATO should be an organization in which the menu is very much limited, and there I'm a little bit afraid when NATO talks about 360 degrees view on security, and then we add different dimensions, because in practice you can't do 360 degrees equally well. There are some azimuths, there are some directions that you put more attention to. But let me start with collective defense, and let me steal something from the second session, because I think this is an important thing, because the foundations are different. The situation in which we are confronted with are different. We don't have the enemies who are just using the military means, who have the tanks amassed at the border. They can still amass tanks at the border, but this is not the only thing, the only tool in their toolbox. So we need to incorporate new functions into our understanding of collective security and deterrence. Modern deterrence is not only about the number of the deployed troops, even though this dominates the headlines right now. Cyber dimension was mentioned a couple of times, and it is important, and it should be underlined, that the defense ministers agreed not only on the forward presence, but also on elevating cyber domain as a domain of security, area of interest for NATO, which is equal with other domains, land, air, or sea. So cyber, of course, right now is part of Article 5 and the collective defense, but it should also be incorporated into other tasks. So the cyber dimension of the crisis management operation, the cyber dimensions of our partnership, because a lot of partners come to us and say, help us with our cyber capabilities, not with training our soldiers to do the first aid. Tell us what can we do to protect our critical infrastructure against cyber threats. Strategic communication. This is also something which should not be incorporated into our thinking across all the tasks. We talk about the ability to send the signals to our potential opponents. It's also about the ability to receive the signals, be able to receive the signals and analyze them as they are. But beyond collective defense, let me just go to the three areas, and there won't be that much new because a number of things were already mentioned. Fight with terrorism. Here we need to be very precise about what role for NATO we want. We need to recognize different faces of terrorists, different ways in which the terrorist organizations operate. So in some areas, the responsibility would be primarily to the member states. In other areas, it would be mostly about the intelligence cooperation, which does not go through NATO. You would have some type of attacks and terrorist activities in which NATO does not really have a role. I recall that I think the first question that Secretary General was asked at the briefing was, what about the Orlando shooting? What can NATO do? And his response was very rightly so. Of course, we are enraged by this attack, and we send our condolences. But I think, beyond that, being brutally honest, there isn't that much that NATO can do. What NATO can do? Can NATO deter some terrorist organizations, the terrorist organizations who are almost state-like, like Hezbollah, like Hamas, from attacking NATO territory? Yes, it can. Can NATO support the countries affected by major terrorist attacks, especially if the terrorists use chemical weapons or radiological weapons? Yes, it can, and yes, it's already doing it. Can NATO fight and destroy specific terrorist organizations after an attack which reached the level of Article 5, when Article 5 was invoked? Yes, it can. Yes, the first time NATO invoked Article 5 was actually over a terrorist attack. Should NATO have a blank check to go out and fight Daesh, Al-Qaeda, other organization? Big question mark. Please show me the plan, show me the strategy first, and then we can discuss. And then the last issue, commitment to supporting the partners and building their capacities. This is not an extra. This is not something we do to make our partners happy. This is a very wise investment of our time, our money, and our efforts that is increasing our security, will increase our security in the past, and lessen the probability that at a certain point we would be asked to do more. We would be asked to engage deeper. The support for Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova was already mentioned, as well as training of the Iraqi and other forces. Afghanistan is an ongoing effort that I think deserves still our attention. And I think at some point we will be asked to train the Libyan forces and to provide more for the Libyan forces. A lot of people will ask, what does it have to do with our security? I would say this is an investment, a pretty small investment that can bring big benefits in the future. And if you ask, why should we do it? Look at Iraq. When we did a mistake of having a very small training presence at NATO and then saw the Iraqi army collapse under pressure, and part of the migration movements which we face right now is connected with our failure to build up Iraqi security. So just to sum up, NATO must do one thing perfectly, or almost perfectly, which is collective defense. Then NATO should be able to do a couple of things pretty well, including support for the stabilization of the neighborhood and working with the partners. And then finally, NATO should be flexible enough to respond to any sudden challenges or demands for the politicians, because the future is, to use a very cliche phrase, very unpredictable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kulesa. And now we are, of course, at the moment when you think there's going to be Q&A session. No, not yet. We have a privileged commentary from our Estonian colleague, Viljar Webel, and considering new kind of threats, please.
Thank you.
Can you please maybe stand up just for all of you to see you?
Hurting, but yeah, thank you. First, I'm happy we have this panel, and we already started the debate, not 5 different monologues which don't make any dialogue, as it often happens. So I tried to go on from where Alessandro and Lukasz started. Is everything actually very good, or do we need some reforms? And I will use the cyber defense as example. Of course, as it is transferred to Russian embassy as well, this broadcast here, so I tried not to use the examples which might interest them, but maybe the public examples. So first, if we think about the Baltics, we think that we are very in a front line and with a very experience in cyber defense. This reminds me, I think it was a year or two ago when the Estonian president had a picture with his Apple laptop where the camera was taped by the MacGyver type because there was no way to protect the president against the cyber attack without the tape. So sometimes we also face the pressure which is bigger than us, and this brings us to the Russian aspect in this, that the starting point is that they are proactive, and they are at least 20 times bigger than us. And I think they are also already playing. So first is, if you decide that playing with the whites in chess is not the fair thing to do, and you will wait until the other side is attacking first, then you will be playing with the black ones, yeah? And once you're playing with the black ones and you have less figures on the table, so you have put yourself to the quantitative disadvantage, which you chose yourself. And then additionally, you somehow decide that it is not moral to have some nasty movements which are not described in the book. So you are only playing by the official rules all the time. And then you somehow expect to win even if you have less experience, because you have what we call rotation in military system, which means that after every 3 years, the people who are competent will be rotated to another place. And then you still try to keep the optimism, and you still try to have a transparent organization. And what next? You're also not allowed to practice the attack to the opponent unless he is attacking you. So you basically build up cyber defense organization, which is based on the usual transparent democratic state rules, which are based on the military logic of hierarchy, which are based on the political control, which are based on official bookkeeping, which are based on social media threats. And your opponent is playing completely differently. He has none of those limits. He can start a game. He can attack as many times as he wants before being successful. Even if they don't manage 99 times and they manage the 100 times, then they're still successful, which has more resources and which does not have the moral limits. And this brings me to the question, where do we need the reforms, and what is the way we sometimes don't bother? Is the organizational culture and understanding that the problem is not that much about the hardware. I teach also in the military academy, and this year we had 2 master theses related how to improve the cybersecurity, and none of them were about programs. One of them was about organizational structure. Let's say the question was how to wake up the guy who needs to make a decision. It's in the middle of night, because in the military you always have to wake up the colonel. You cannot make yourself. So it means you need the procedure or you need the leadership model reformed. And the second was rules of engagement, which is very tricky thing, because everybody on the area needs to have the knowledge. But the Russians don't need to have the knowledge. What are the rules of engagement? And if the media will receive the envelope with the rules of engagement, there will be a big scandal. Because if you put the very mild rules inside the envelope, you cannot match the threats. But if you put the real rules of engagement to the envelope and it goes to the media, then it's a big scandal. So I think I opened up a little bit this idea that to summarize, we need to be more preemptive. We need to focus more. It's not about even 2% from GDP. I think if Russians are putting 6, that is what we need to counterbalance. And we need first also to work very hard about our moral and organizational cultural restrictions, which we set ourselves. There is no one else who is like limiting us. It's us who do that. And also we need to look how to include the civilian competence to the cyber defense, and also maybe other areas of defense as well. We a little bit too close that. It means that we don't feel the threat that the Russians are pushing.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wiebel. And I believe that was quite nice provocative bridge, switching over to the questions, which is always questionably to abandon morality. It's always kind of tricky. But I believe we can fix a set of questions already here. We're going to address to the panel, but now is the right moment, and we are working according to the model that we're going to take all the questions what we have in the room, and then we're going to answer in a bigger blocks, giving the answers from the panelists. So are there questions in the room? There should be at least one. It's usually we arrange the one question before, but we are that would be in another kind of country. Yeah. Okay, that's additional, Mark. Yes, we're gonna definitely, all of us gonna answer to Estonian colleagues' question about increasing, I believe, the resources and the budget and increasing offensive capabilities and stuff like that. But other questions, all the questions was collected in one person, Mr. Wiebel here in front, then it would be quite interesting. Yes, please, you get the cookie for the first question. Please bring the mic for the people online here what you're speaking on.
No, it's just a short question. I would be interested, because I'm always following the EU track, and I'm from Austria, neutral country, and I remember 10 years ago the issue of cooperation between EU and NATO was a hotter topic than now. Maybe I'm wrong. I would like to know maybe where we stand now.
Thank you very much. Okay, where we stand now with the EU. Other questions? Yes, please, microphone there.
Good morning.
Morning. Please, in the mic if you can.
Yeah. I was wondering, the original concept of NATO is of course setting up a credible defense, but you slowly get the impression that there's a kind of development where territorial defense is creeping in to this concept of credible deterrence, especially here in the Baltics. I would say not directly in other NATO countries. Is it possible for you to elaborate on that and if this is a sensible development? I'm the Netherlands ambassador over here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. More questions? If no, then we're going to start to answer these, and then afterwards, if there's going to be a time, we will take others. Then, of course, the first, respecting Estonian colleague and its provocative content. Could you please give a comment on, first of all, the, well, resource behind the NATO, and is it adequate? And maybe your comment on the budget and the money behind that, because you're always bringing in the game the basics, which is resource, not only the money but also the time and other kind of resources. So who gonna start this topic on ability to compete in the worldwide where other people are paying for security a bit more?
Well, I think when we look at the results of the Wales summit meeting, one important deliverable was the defense pledge, and all countries agreed that they should increase their defense spendings. Right now, only 5 allied countries could meet the target of 2% GDP, and others still in the process of filling in the gaps, but the trend is positive. At least the allies could be able to stop the decrease in defense budgets, and there is a trend upwards. And of course, not only 2% of GDP is the criteria, but 20% of the defense spending should be to new equipment. And I think that this pledge should be furthered by tangible means, and I know that many countries have solid plans to meet the criteria, and it is an absolute necessity when we take the existing challenges from different fronts to have a credible capabilities lined up to respond to these challenges. If I may also respond to the NATO-EU cooperation, I think right now the level of cooperation is much better than 13 years ago, for instance. I was ambassador to NATO from 2006 to 2009, and NATO-EU cooperation was in the core of our discussions. But I must say, even staff-to-staff level coordination and cooperation was not at this point. Right now we have a coordination in hybrid warfare, cyber security. We have playbooks and we try to develop them in parallel to each other. Another area that we focus on is to complement each other with respect to efforts in defense capacity building, in projecting stability in the neighborhood. Third area is maritime security, and our Italian colleague has referred to the challenges, threats coming from the south. It also requires an effective means to take the routes of communication in maritime area open, and right now we see the ongoing operation in the Aegean. SNMG is present with 8 maritime vessel ships there, and it gives a very good opportunity for NATO to monitor have reconnaissance and surveillance, to gather information and to share it, not only with countries concerned, Turkey and Greece, but also with Frontex. At the same time, we have Operation Active Endeavour, which was initiated as an Article 5 operation, and NATO is now in the process of transforming it to non-Article 5 operation, which will enable NATO to interact and cooperate with the European Union. There is an ongoing Operation Sophia, and what NATO aims is to be able to cooperate with the European Union in face of challenges like the one emanating from the situation in Libya, and it would also add to our capacity to increase situational awareness, but also to support, assist, and advise the countries of the South in defense capacity building. So I can say that much has been achieved so far. It is not yet there for us to be fully satisfied, and it also relates to certain issues related to the Cyprus question, and we hope that the negotiations could bring about a lasting settlement, which would also add to our ability to bring a qualitative change in NATO-EU cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a very limited time, so biggest interest rate, I believe, is on the questions, considering the first one. Then I want to somehow, I don't know why, but I want to make this like not the boxing game, no, but still I see that the main communicator of NATO Strategic Communication Center of Excellence could give a proper, not answer, but the vision. What is the? Can we abandon some of values which we're saying here and act a bit more differently, or this is threat per se to do like that?
Well, short answer would be no, because I don't think we would like to see the kind of cyber environment which would evolve from that kind of a decision ourselves. And I would actually disagree with some of the sort of conclusive elements. First, that Russians spent far more, compared to whom? If I think of the sum of the allies, I would argue with that. I think some of the allies are spending quite a lot of money on the cyber defense, and not only the defense, active defense as it is called. Second thing I would argue is that they're in all of the areas they're doing something that we can't do. I think we have to distinguish what kind of attacks we're talking about, because the cyber attacks was an aim to just profit, and this is a criminal world mostly operating in there, and their criminals sometimes are better. The second is what I call an influence attack or disruptive attack, and there I would agree with you. We play by the different moral rules, and there is the third attack that is aimed at getting information. Although I think we have, in collective sense, more strict rules. How do you do that? But I think we're also playing in that game, obviously. And I wouldn't necessarily say they are far more doing far more different things that one would imagine us doing. So there's actually one area which is influence attacks or disruptive attacks, where they are really having no moral boundaries that we would have. Do you think abandoning them would actually help to deter the attack? I'm not that sure. I would agree with two other premises, and that is we have to spend more on this area, because whenever we develop more digital, not only defense but also the society, we gain more vulnerabilities. So whenever you enlarge the whole thing, you have to think more about defense. Organizationally, I do believe in the rules of engagement. I do believe, because once again, back to my first comment, we are about the values. And like in a sort of communication world, I say, you don't fight propaganda with propaganda. I would say the same in a cyber world. Because at the end of the day, the reason what we are is because the kind of world we're trying to create. And we start to bend the rules, I don't think in a long term, the outcome would be something that we would ourselves like.
Thank you very much. So, but the question is also, well, touching a bit more. You raise the hand or just scratch your... Okay, just scratch. The question, it goes more behind that. How far should NATO engage going outside its, well, let's call it territorial, considering also the migration issue. The migration in the south, it's coming from far more than our boundaries. And which is this, I don't know, at least from vision perspective, should we do that or should we not? This time I'm going to address Mr. Kulesa and Mr. Marrone, maybe your comment from the south and the European perspective.
I don't think NATO has a direct role in managing the migration crisis, but it has a support role for the European Union in terms of maritime security, and has a support role for countries where, because of crisis or instability, migration originates or transit. So in terms of defense capacity building for partners. A couple of comments just on the question raised by the audience as well. On cyber, more assets, more expert, more investment, yes, it's needed. Also because it's a relatively modest investment with greater output. Stop to play play the rule of the game. I fully agree with Jānis. It's really a matter of values and of internal consensus. Now, let me add on this that in the cyber domain, the offense is by nature in a position of advantage with respect to defense. It's easier to attack. It's easier to steal information. It's easier to crack a system than to protect. So this is really tricky. You outline the difficulty very well. Maybe it's the same trick of intelligence, where in terms of intelligence it's easier to attack than to defend. And maybe in the cyber domain we can find similar solution of what has been found for intelligence, which should think about it perhaps in closed-door seminars rather than in public conferences. And forgive me for this Machiavelli-style answer.
That's okay, you're from the same region, so please.
Thank you. Mārtiņš, you asked me for a European approach, which I find interesting because all of us here in the panels are Europeans, so all of our responses are the European responses per se. And also on this issue of how far do we go with cyber, this is an area in which, at the national level, as you know perfectly well, things are happening not only on the defensive side of the spectrum. And if you read and believe all the whistleblowers, the Snowdens of this world, some of our allies don't have any moral inhibitions to engage in spying. And also engage in basically interfering and stopping illicit activities, be it by the states or by non-state entities. So I'm not sure if this kind of picture that we're just doing defense, whereas the other side is just doing offense, is the full picture. And I'm a little bit worried that we start to look at Russia and China as models. Especially if you believe the stories about their attacks against the banking systems and their attacks against some elements of the critical infrastructure, for example, Ukrainian power stations. I hope we're not going this route as the alliance. On the cooperation between NATO and the EU, it is a quiet evolution. Some people would say a quiet revolution, but it is certainly an evolution which is helped by a good personal relationship between Ms. Mogherini and the Secretary General. I'm very happy to see it. Some boring bureaucrats are telling that this is all good, but we need a framework, because without a framework in place that would, for example, allow us to exchange classified information, all of this cooperation can stop if we have a different political combination. So I'm very much looking forward to resolving the Cyprus issue, which would allow us to do this cooperation. And migration, sorry that took so long to get there. For me, as far as I see the NATO response to migration, this is a classic example of this "I was born to make you happy" approach. In a sense, there is a problem, we throw something at it, and then we say that this is a NATO response. A lot of experts claim that putting the ships from the Maritime Standing Group into the Aegean to watch for the smugglers' boat, it's not the wisest use of our funds, but we're doing it and we're labeling it as a NATO response to migration. So I'm not sure if this is the best approach to the problem, which might be left to a number of other organizations.
Thank you. Yep, please.
Add to the previous speakers' comments on cyber security, and in response to our Estonian colleague, I think Warsaw Summit meeting, as I alluded to earlier, would focus on cyber defense, and the announcement of cyber as a domain would provide us to better have resources, skills to be coordinated and pulled out among allies. And I agree with my Estonian colleague that we should be able to increase our capability in that sense to counter any cyber threat coming from different directions. But at the same time, we have to be very careful. We have to take into account the defensive nature of our organization, and that it is an alliance based on values, and we should not follow things in tit-for-tat approach. We should not deviate from the very principle that even in terms of countering disinformation and propaganda, we cannot go for propaganda. We should stick to truth, and in cyber area we should be defensive but not in an offensive approach. So this should be the frame of mind to guide our future efforts.
Thank you, and very short 25-second comment.
Actually, what I wanted to point out, it's not about getting money more, but was about being mentally ready to respond when the moment comes. It's not that, it's like you're boxing with Valuyev, and you still think that you can have it with Thai, but then he's punching you, and you say, oh no, that's not fair, and then he's punching again, and maybe when you start to fight the Russian cyber attacks, your computer is hacked already and encrypted, and I think sometimes the usual military tradition is to fight with the rules and to think that the opponent will do some maneuvers before, or some special rituals before he will attack. But I think that is the main weakness of putting military colonels to the cyber defense structure, is that they're expecting the opponent to play the same logic. And I think they need to educate themselves more about, for example, game theory, to understand it's not the same game they're playing. Thank
25 seconds. Thank you. Thank you very much. And of course, this is a point for discussion. At the same time, my encouragement is, and that I'm saying on my own, not so much under-evaluate our capabilities in every speech. I already raised this issue up in some other conference in the Latvian parliament, considering the NATO that Mr. Sārts was joining. We like to whine and kick ourselves that we are so, well, not so good as we think, but still the capabilities are good. They should be increased, definitely. Stick to the true. I'm going to steal this line. We're going to stick to the true. The time is over. And now is the 20-minute coffee break, and we will be in the same room and back with the next topic between reassurance and deterrence. Thank you very much, everyone.